Everybody for joining me this afternoon, my time, and this morning, your time. So I'm going to be trying to talk about feedback literacy in higher education, but I'd like to suggest at the outset that actually feedback literacy, or the capacities to make the most of feedback, is actually a lifelong learning skill and something that we probably need in our family life and in the workplace. Feedback is all around us, but I think we all know it isn't always very easy to give feedback, and it sometimes isn't that easy to receive feedback. So hopefully an interesting topic, particularly for education, but even for our daily lives. I don't know about you guys, but I quite like interacting on Twitter around assessment, feedback, digital learning, etc. So I've put my Twitter handle there in case anybody is interested in continuing the dialogue there. And if you are, welcome to post comments or the slides or anything else you'd like to do. Okay. Basically, this is the framework for my sharing today. I'm going to try to set the scene through the first three stages. And then, as Martin said, I'll pause after section 3 in this overview to have a little bit of interaction. Then in parts 4 and 5, I'll go into some of the more practical implications of feedback literacy, and then I'll conclude with some implications and some avenues for further research. But I'm going to start with the challenges for feedback that feedback literacy is trying to address. I think many of us know that feedback sometimes can be quite a lot of work, but it doesn't always seem to reap the dividends or the benefits from the hard work that teachers put in. Students may also have their own reservations. So a number of challenges, and I've tried to summarize them on this slide. And I'll kind of try to give an overview and then try and unpack the issues a little bit more. Firstly, the timing. I think one of the big problems we have in universities in terms of feedback is the way our courses are inevitably structured, in the sense that in a modularized system, students usually do at least one of their assignments or an exam or a big task at the end of the course. So if they're submitting something at the end of the course, it's going to be very difficult for any feedback to come usefully from that exchange. They may receive a grade, they may receive some comments, but it's going to come after the teaching of the course is finished. And I think this is one of the main complaints that students usually have, that feedback often comes too late for them to be able to use. So that's going to imply some kind of creativity in designing feedback from teachers. The second point, feedback or comments are often not comprehensible to students. You know, sometimes we might say, you need to be more critical, or you need more synthesis. Well, unless the student has a reasonably solid conception of criticality or synthesis or whatever it is, it can be very difficult for them to appreciate, particularly written feedback. Then thirdly, students often don't have the learning strategies necessarily to transfer feedback from one course to another. Usually in higher education, you're going from course to course, from year to year. So maybe teachers should be scaffolding or supporting students a bit more in how they might make use of feedback opportunities. Fourthly, And I think most of us are familiar with this aspect of the kind of emotional or social affective elements of feedback. And I think probably we feel this particularly strongly as a young person. We want appreciation, we want our hard work to be valued. So there's a difficult tension or balance here between giving honest critical feedback and then not upsetting our students too much. And it's also very difficult because it varies. Some high achieving students may want more critical feedback to help them get even better. Other students may feel they just want a bit more encouragement. So getting this balance is very difficult. And then fifthly, sometimes in the university sector, feedback is a one-way transmission process, sometimes in writing, sometimes or digitally. So if there are not opportunities for any interaction or potential dialogue around the feedback, then I think that underpins or consolidates all of the previous 4 points. Now, sometimes teachers will say to me one of the biggest barriers to feedback is large classes. Now, I think there is some truth in that. If you have a very large class and the relationships are not so solid, it makes everything a bit more difficult. However, I don't think feedback is at all easy, even in a one-to-one situation with a family member. Or for me, I do a lot of doctoral supervision, and sometimes I find it quite difficult to get on the right wavelength with some of my doctoral students. I sometimes tell them, well, this is not how we do things in academic writing. And some of my doctoral students are in their 30s or 40s or even slightly more mature, and they have their own way of doing things, and they're not always that open. And I think that's human life. So I'm not sure large classes is such a major issue because feedback is always a complex social communication. But I think in large classes, peer feedback is a very good strategy, and I'll come on to that later. Just to contextualize this slide a little bit more, I want to go back to the first ever piece of feedback research I did. We collected data from a questionnaire and from qualitative means in around 2004, and my paper came out in the journal Studies in Higher Education in 2006. And one of the things this paper uncovered is the different perspectives of teachers and students. The teachers were convinced that their feedback was much more useful than the students thought it was. In addition, the students' main complaint was the timing. They found it frustrating when comments came at the end of the course after the grade was awarded, and then they couldn't do anything with those comments. They almost found it annoying. Now I finished the course, you've given me a grade, and now you tell me what to do. If you'd have only told me this earlier, I could have done better work for you. I could have got a higher grade. So there were quite interesting undercurrents there. And to be honest, when I wrote this paper, when I was writing it in 2004-5, feedback was a relatively under-researched area. And then in the last 10 years or so, there's been a rapid explosion of feedback research. And I think one of the reasons is an accountability issue. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the National Student Survey in England, but they have these accountability data from students, and the students usually say that assessment and feedback are the least satisfactory elements of their undergraduate experience. So all the senior management in British universities have been looking for solutions or quick fixes or ideas around feedback. So it's become quite a hot topic. One of the top scholars in feedback, particularly in the period maybe 2000 to 2015, or even before that, is Roy Sadler from Griffith University, now University of Queensland. He wrote a fantastic article on formative assessment in 1989, got a lot of citations, and has a lot of wisdom around formative assessment and feedback. And I quite like this quote from him about the difficulties of teacher telling forms of feedback and how they often don't connect with students, or they don't enable students to move forward. Another major concern in commentary, grading, or feedback is the amount of time teachers sometimes spend marking student work, giving commentary. And I think Bowd and Malloy make a very useful point here, that it isn't worth our while spending so much time on commentary unless there is some prospect that the students are actually going to use the information that we are providing. So maybe there is a need for us to distinguish between the grading function of assessment, which is basically giving a fair mark, and the commenting or feedback function. And the grading function can come right at the end, but the commentary function, if it's at the end, is unlikely to be able to be used. So maybe we might distinguish grading from feedback, or grading from commentary, and try to front load more of the commentary so it comes during the course of a module, during a course, so that students are able to use it. Another very famous formative assessment researcher who particularly does work in schools is Dylan Wiliam. And Dylan Wiliam always says that feedback should be more work for the student than it is for the teacher. Feedback should be more work for the student than for the teacher. And I think if we reflect on our own practices, perhaps that is rarely the case. So if we can maybe work around how we can use time more effectively in feedback, we can increase the impact and maybe even reduce the teacher workload. Along with my writing partner, Naomi Winstone, University of Surrey, we've tried to conceptualize an old paradigm of feedback, which is teachers producing comments, versus a new paradigm of feedback, which is more focused on students generating through peer feedback, generating through self-assessment, and then trying to build on these comments and use them to focus on uptake. But I should acknowledge that most people think of feedback as a teacher role, but we think to make it more productive, we need to move it in the direction of a more active student role. And we talk about this in our recent book called Designing Effective Feedback Processes in Higher Education, a Learning Focused Approach. So I want to try to introduce the concept of feedback literacy that maybe some of you have heard of, some of you are familiar with, some of you may be a little bit less so. But I guess it's trying to tackle some of those challenges I had in that slide with the 5 challenges on. Feedback literacy is not my term, but I think I've played a role in popularizing it in the last 3 to 4 years. But it was originated by a British scholar called Paul Sutton, who's now retired, and he had an article in the journal Innovations in Education and Teaching International, where he introduced this concept of feedback literacy, and he built it on the work of people like Lear and Street in terms of academic literacies. So when I first thought about feedback literacy, I kind of had two strands in my mind. One of them on the left-hand side, literacies plural, to kind of hint at the dynamic and contested and situated nature of literacies. And academic literacies and digital literacies seem to follow that kind of trend. But on the right-hand side, we had the very significant concept of assessment literacy, mainly introduced and popularized at Oxford Brookes University by scholars such as Margaret Price, Chris Rust, and more recently Barry O'Donovan. And when I started working on my first paper on feedback literacy, I was wondering whether to call it feedback literacies plural, with the influences on the left-hand side, or feedback literacy singular, with the influences on the right-hand side. And it seemed to us that feedback literacy was perhaps a subset of assessment literacy, so maybe the singular form was most appropriate. But I don't know if this was the correct way to go, and maybe we would have had more originality in using feedback literacies plural, and I think it's still open to debate. But that was what we resolved at the time, to stick with the singular form. And I think another very significant trend in the literature on feedback, and probably one of the most significant papers in the last 10 years, is Bowden-Malloy's paper in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, that emphasized, among other things, that the role of the teacher is less to give comments and more to design learning environments for students to give feedback, students to give peer feedback to each other, students to compose peer feedback, students to analyze and compare their work with others, self-assessment. So in other words, a much broader conception of feedback that you will see in a conventional dictionary definition of feedback. And I think this was a very important step in thinking feedback is not something that just happens by chance at the end of a course. It's something that needs to be designed in stages and steps, and that it needs to be front-loaded more than end-loaded, because at the end, it's mainly a grading operation. So in the next few slides, I'm going to try to elaborate on the concept of student feedback literacy as I developed it in collaboration with Professor David Boud, now at Cradle in Deakin University, one of the powerhouses of assessment and feedback research. So our definition of feedback literacy was pretty much as follows: that the student needs to have understandings, capacities, attitudes or dispositions to take a positive view of what feedback could do for them, and to be willing to put in the hard work to make sense of feedback, generate it or use it. So we decided to start with the student role because I think it followed these trends I've been trying to hint at, that I think we're arguing that really the student is the most important player in feedback. It's only the student who can improve. It's only the student who can learn. It's the student who is the key player, with the teacher as the kind of facilitator and designer. So I think that was essentially our position. And we developed this framework of 3 to 4 components. In some ways it's 3 and in some ways it's 4, because the 3 at the top are converging on what we saw as the most essential element of feedback is the students taking action and actually doing something with the feedback. In terms of taking action, that could still be a decision not to take up the feedback. I think that is also an action. When you analyze something, you think it doesn't make sense and you reject it through a purposeful decision-making process. I think that is taking action. Well, ignoring the feedback or not collecting it or not reading it is not an action. But basically, we felt that students need to appreciate feedback. They need to be making judgments of more sophisticated quality over time. And we saw that as one of the main outcomes of higher education is the kind of development of the capacities to make solid academic judgments about your own work and that of others. And then the kind of emotional managing affect aspects on the right-hand side. So I'll just try to tease out very briefly those components. So appreciating feedback has two subcomponents. One is seeing the value of feedback, realizing that it can be worth engaging with and it's gonna be useful. And the second one, appreciating the student's own active role in feedback. In other words, not just passively waiting for somebody to tell you what to do, but taking a kind of positive, kind of proactive kind of stance in feedback. The judgment aspects, I think, cohere nicely with self-regulated learning and self-monitoring kind of strategies. That a good feedback literate university student needs to be self-monitoring their work in progress and getting better at understanding the nature of good quality work, how they can improve, how they can make good decisions, how they can enhance their work. The managing affect dimension to do with these feelings and emotions and attitudes, not being discouraged too much by negative feedback, being willing to receive critical comment, but then use it in productive ways. Perhaps in a similar way to scholars and academics have to deal with peer review. When we submit to a journal, then we get rejected, and then we have to decide what to do next. And I think the better we are at managing our emotions in these kind of situations, the better we are for success in academia and for lifelong learning. Roy Sadler talked in his research about dangling data. Dangling data arises when teacher comments go nowhere, when the data is provided by the teacher, but the student either doesn't receive it, doesn't engage with it, doesn't work with it. So one of the key developments, I think, in the last 5 or 10 years again in feedback and feedback literacy research is the idea that comments or feedback information only close a feedback loop or close a feedback cycle when students take action. And some scholars like to talk about the way an air conditioning unit works, or an engineering kind of approach where the input leads to an output and there is some kind of closing of a cycle. And the challenge in higher education is, can we develop virtuous cycles of closing feedback loops? So that was our conception of feedback literacy. It was conceptual work. It just really came out of our brains and our analysis of literature. But then Malloy, Bowd, and Henderson, who had a very large data set in a feedback for student learning project in Australia, a collaboration between Monash and Deakin universities, they had an existing data set and they tried to infer from the data set some principles of student feedback literacy And you can see on this slide, what they came up with was roughly similar with what the Carless and Bowd paper came up with. But I think they had a few minor enhancements, and I've underlined two of the enhancements. I think they correctly paid a bit more attention than we had done to the importance of eliciting information or feedback seeking strategies, an area in which our host Martin has done some very good work. I think they made a little bit more emphasis than we had in the original paper on the feedback seeking aspects, and they're very important, and I'll come back to them a bit later in the talk. I think they also had an improved terminology or a way of describing what we originally called managing affect. They talked about acknowledging and working with the emotions. I think working with the emotions is a usefully positive way of raising those affective challenges of feedback processes. But I think basically the two papers, Carless and Bowd 2018, Malloy, Bowd and Henderson 2020, seem to have roughly congruent conceptions of student feedback literacy. In terms of learning theories, in my work, I've mainly deployed social constructivist learning theories, but I think sociocultural theory is also extremely pertinent, and Rachel Esterhazy in Oslo is extremely good at applying sociocultural theories to feedback research. I recommend her work most highly. And also Karen Gravatt in University of Surrey, colleague of Naomi Winstone's, has made an interesting starting point in terms of socio-material approaches to feedback literacies, plural. And I think that's also interesting work that may be developed further as we move on. Now, in terms of critiques of this concept of feedback literacy, I've put three common critiques on this slide, but I welcome in the audience any other comments in the chat on what you think may be some of the limitations of feedback literacy as currently conceptualized. The first one in Karen Gravatt's paper suggests that maybe feedback literacy assumes a bit more agency and freedom that students and teachers may have than that is commonly experienced in universities, and particularly in the neoliberal climate. Are we kind of imprisoned by accountability forces, workload, and other factors? I think we do acknowledge that point, but there are a number of challenges. Another occasional concern about feedback literacy, and Philip Dawson mentioned this one again last week in the symposium we had. Does it seem that we are somehow saying, well, if students had more feedback literacy, then some of the problems might be reduced? I think the argument against this potential critique is that we argue and we believe that effective feedback processes rely on shared responsibilities between teachers and students. Shared responsibilities in that we need students to put in the hard work to make the effort to engage with and use feedback. But we also need us as teachers to design feedback in ways which enable students to use feedback. We need feedback to be delivered sensitively. We need relationships. So I think we're fairly clear in the literature that we are hoping that through partnerships between students and teachers, teachers and students, there is some potential for mutually more satisfying feedback episodes or exchanges. Then the third potential critique is around the notion of what is a literacy or what are literacies. Is there a danger we end up with too many literacies and we can have this literacy and that literacy? And then another issue around definition is it the right kind of terminology? I mean, would something like capacities or capabilities be an equally good term? But I suppose as academics, we want to produce something catchy and citable. And feedback literacy was a term that people were talking about. Not many people were saying feedback capacities, feedback capabilities, although they could have done. So feedback literacy just seemed a term that had some currency. So I think feedback literacy, singular or plural, seems to me to be a quite useful concept or label for what it is that we are talking about. I'll just share a few slides on teacher feedback literacy, and then I will pause for some questions and comments. So the idea is that student feedback literacy and teacher feedback literacy are complementary capacities, and that each one can feed into the other, in that the better teachers can design feedback, the more profitable it is likely to be for students, and then the more convinced they are that this thing called feedback can be useful for them. And then the more that students communicate with teachers about how they feel about feedback and what kind of feedback they want, then teachers are going to be in a better position. So we very much see it as a kind of partnership. I don't know if this is too idealized. I don't know whether in mass higher education we have so many things on our plate. I don't know whether it is entirely feasible, but this is our vision as feedback researchers for students and teachers to try to work together in making more profitable and satisfying feedback processes. So we basically defined teacher feedback literacy as the knowledge and expertise to design feedback processes to enable student uptake. I think design has been a key word of what I've said so far in terms of the teacher role. And then in our framework in this paper, in teaching in higher education, we emphasized the design elements. We also alluded to the relational elements, and we also alluded to the practicalities of workload and the practicalities of the discipline and the context. And then we tried in this diagram to try to kind of encapsulate the interplay or the interrelationships between teacher feedback literacy and student feedback literacy, because we kind of see them as inextricably intertwined, as it were. Okay, so I've been talking for half an hour or so, and at this point I'd like to welcome any critical comments from the floor. Welcome to tell me why it may not work in your context. Questions, comments, whatever you'd like to say, please feel free.
Okay, so David, there have been a few questions. The first one was more a theoretical question. You talked a bit about the students' difficulty to decode feedback. And Anne is wondering what you would say is the difference between a difficulty to decode feedback and the lack of adequate learning strategies.
I suppose for the decoding, ideally we need more interaction and dialogue. So if we can find means through peer feedback, through online conversations, I think that can reduce the decoding element. So by decoding, really, I'm meaning whether the students can understand what the feedback means. I think the person asking the question is drawing quite a clever link, because it seems to me there is a linkage between the decoding and then the feedback strategies. But I think there are also some potential differences. For example, your strategies might be reminding yourself in the next assignment that you need to be paying attention to a certain issue. And the next assignment might be 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months later. So I think sometimes we need a strategy to revisit the key issues, to synthesize feedback. Perhaps if I could exemplify that through what I try to do in my academic writing. I've been submitting articles to journals now for about 25 years. So over that time, I've received probably a couple of hundred of reviews, and I've tried to internalize in my mind what I think reviewers will often say about my research or my writing or my way of trying to demonstrate my article is a good one. So I have a kind of checklist in my own mind, and then I will revisit my checklist when I'm working on my publication. So it seems to me that is a strategy, and I think students need to be taught some of these strategies, and I think we need to model for them some of our own feedback learning strategies, as it were, in the way I've just done in that example.
All right, thank you. Another question from Marianne. She's wondering if you think there is a difference between the way you support students to develop their literacy in online and between online and offline education.
I think probably we need the same principles. Positive relationships, enthusiasm, good teaching and learning designs, not too much emphasis on one-way transmission of content, but trying to think of where the students are and how we can build on them. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to share some ideas around audio feedback and video feedback. And there are also ideas around online discussions, online quizzes. So I would see that the principles of face-to-face and online feedback are roughly the same, but some of the operational mechanisms may vary to some extent.
Right. Another question from Johan. How long do you think it takes for students to develop optimal feedback literacy skills?
I think it is a lifelong learning skill. And I think when they come in from schooling, they've had a very different experience. In school, you're seeing your teachers every day. So the feedback is quite different to what it is in university, when you can actually go several weeks or months without getting much feedback. The relationships obviously are generally much less familiar in universities. Some students say to me, well, nobody actually knows my name in university. It's all a bit anonymous. So I think there are some challenges there. But I think that we are all hopefully trying to develop ourselves in different ways over the course of a lifetime. And I think there are some students who come into university with quite highly developed feedback literacy skills, and there are some with relatively modest feedback literacy skills. And I think if we can teach them how to make judgments, how to do peer feedback well, how to learn from examples in the literature, then I think we are setting the scene for them to develop, because I really think to be an effective lifelong learner, feedback literacy skills are one of the things that you need.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any more time for questions, or if you want to continue with your presentation. There are questions though, but I don't know what your timing.
Do you want to do one more question at this point?
Sure. Let me see. I've seen a few questions on peer feedback. Someone was wondering where peer feedback comes in your in your theory on feedback literacy, and someone else is asking if it matters if let me see. Like students don't seem to grasp the importance of peer feedback. So can you tell us something about that?
Yes, I see peer feedback as very important part of feedback literacy. It's going in my second box, if you remember, the making judgments box, because in order to give feedback and give peer feedback and use peer feedback, you need to be making judgments about others' work and your own work. I agree that sometimes students don't quite see the point of peer feedback, or they're not able to implement it well. And I think this is one of the capacities of the feedback literate teacher, that they are more skilled at setting up, selling, and implementing peer feedback processes. And as that's a theme in my second half, which is going more into the practice, perhaps if you don't mind, I'll go into the second half, because I've got a couple of slides that do relate to peer feedback. So basically, the second half is meant to be more practical and focusing particularly on the kind of digital applications that are salient in our current socially distanced world. And as I've already elaborated, we see the teacher role as mainly to design the learning environment in such a way that students can generate through peer feedback and then use the comments to enhance their own work. And I particularly like this article that comes out of the Netherlands, University of Utrecht. I don't know if anybody from that university is with us today, but I really like this article because it's in a large class, it's in online education, but I think it exemplifies the principles very nicely by focusing on audio peer feedback. I don't make a big distinction between audio peer feedback and video peer feedback. I think they're essentially the same operations. But this research was based on 3 SPOCs and 3 MOOCs. There was questionnaires and there were interviews. And basically, some of the key findings was that audio peer feedback could enhance the relationships between the participants. And I think this is already a very important point. You know, in the COVID world, a lot of people are having to stay at home, sometimes on their own or just with one other member. And the relational side of audio or video peer feedback can be very useful in enhancing a sense of commitment, a sense of relationship, building up a kind of social network with your classmates. Another great potential benefit of seeing other people's work is that it enables us to understand our own learning process. I think this is the most important part about peer feedback. It is not so much that you will get some brilliant insight from your classmate or your peer. Frankly speaking, that is quite rare. Your peer is not going to give you some marvelously insightful comment. Where you are most likely to gain is through seeing other people's work. When we see other people's work, we naturally make comparisons between our own production and that of others. So we're making a profitable comparative process between our work and that of our peers. And I think there's a powerful message here. Even if your peer does not give you any useful feedback, you can still gain a lot yourself through the rich process of composing feedback. Composing peer feedback involves you in analyzing, thinking of criteria, diagnosing solutions, and explaining those solutions in a useful, practical, and sensitive way. So composing peer feedback is a very rich process, and most research indicates that composing peer feedback is even more beneficial than receiving peer feedback because it's a richer process and it involves comparison. So I think that's quite an important and sometimes underestimated issue in peer feedback. As scholars in Europe, such as Esther van Popter and David Nicol in his 2014 paper and in his recent paper, one of the powers of examples and/or peer feedback is this comparison process that we naturally go through. And Nicol argues that we always do this. When we observe someone doing a presentation, we make comparisons with our own presentation style. When we do peer observation of teaching, we notice what they do that is similar to our teaching and what is different. The same when we read the work of peers, and he believes this is one of the most important and fundamental ways of learning by comparison, and he thinks we should design our courses to enable students to compare their work with that of multiple others. Not just one other, because that's quite limited, but if you can see a range of different research, 2 or 3 other kinds of attempts at a similar task, then you're in a good position to learn and take advantage of those comparisons. And Nicol calls this internal feedback, the kind of inner feedback that's going on in our minds, and he feels that is much more powerful than anything a teacher can say or a peer can say. His argument is that internal feedback is at the fundamental element of student-focused feedback, and he argues quite convincingly in my mind that internal feedback produced by the student is the most powerful form of feedback. And he claims, and I think he's correct, that students are doing this all the time, even if it is not always at a sophisticated level. Students are thinking, well, I need more references here. This part is too long. This part is too short. Maybe I need to get it proofread. Conversations we're always having, if we can scaffold for students how to do this better, then they will be in a better position for lifelong learning, and they can also make the feedback process more efficient. In addition to audio feedback, I also think that peer-to-peer video feedback is a nice activity, and this is from a scholar in Taiwan who had the students sharing peer-to-peer video feedback via Facebook, which I think is also a very nice strategy. So in that part, I was emphasizing the peer feedback, but I also acknowledged that for social presence and for other reasons, teachers may be producing some short segments of video feedback. One of the rationales is that you can talk much quicker than you can write. Another rationale is it's much easier to have rapport and nuance in spoken feedback than it is in written feedback. And we think that 2 to 3 minutes is ample or about the right amount of audio or video feedback from a teacher. If it's more than 2 or 3 minutes, the student is likely to be overwhelmed with messages. So short and snappy, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, a few main points. But most importantly, it mustn't be the dangling data. There must be some kind of student response or follow-up. It could be a future assessment task. It could be a response. But for all forms of feedback, to be closing a virtuous feedback loop or feedback cycle, we need some kind of student response or student follow-up. Remember Dylan Williams' advice, feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. It should be more work for the student. So whatever we've done with our feedback, we want them to do something in response. The picture is Michael Henderson, Monash University, who was the principal investigator of the Feedback for Learning project, which led to some of the publications I referred to earlier. This is the kind of simple design we're thinking of in terms of the practicalities of designing for student uptake, whether it's 3 tasks, 2 tasks, but if it was task 1, followed by teacher video feedback or peer video feedback, then task 2, for them to implement the feedback, then this is the kind of design that we envisage as a way of facilitating the uptake of feedback messages. In the last 5 minutes or so, I just want to tease out a few implications and future directions. I don't know if you guys have come across this book by an American scholar called James Lang, but it's called Small Teaching. I find the title a little bit funny, Small Teaching, because what he really means is small change or small adjustments to teaching. But publishers often have their ideas about what is a catchy title. But basically, his idea is teachers are busy. They already have a lot on their plate. Are there some scientific research-based strategies that we can add to our existing repertoire that could spark a positive change without being too time-consuming or too difficult to implement? And I like that idea because at heart I'm always a teacher and somebody who tries to be practical, I hope. So one of my ideas for small change to teaching, small change to feedback would be to allow students more possibilities to ask for the kind of feedback they're looking for. So for example, the eliciting function of feedback can be operationalized on the cover sheet of the assignments when the students could be encouraged and scaffolded to write, I would most like feedback on the way I organize my literature review. Or can you give me some new ideas on the theories of XXX because I found that quite difficult. Or I found it difficult to summarize the implications at the end of my essay. How do you think I did on that part? We think this can make feedback less of a one-way transmission process, and we think it can support students to be on the same wavelength, as it were, with the teachers. So we feel this is quite simple and practical. Just at the top of the assignment or on the cover sheet, they just suggest what kind of commentary they would most like to receive. And the idea is that the teacher will respond to their request, but of course the teacher is welcome to offer any other suggestions in the normal way. But we hope it's a way of making feedback a bit more interactive and a bit more focused. And it seems to me this is a bit more like how we handle feedback in real life. And I've made a reference to Phil Dawson's concept of authentic feedback here. If I approach somebody for feedback, I don't just give them a big document and say, give me feedback. I usually signal what particular areas I'm struggling with or I'm focused on. And I even sometimes ask different scholars for different comments on different aspects of my work. So I might ask somebody about the research method, somebody else about the discussion, somebody else about the literature review. So it seems to me trying to focus feedback requests on areas of concern could be a useful and practical way to go. And I think it's also underpinned by literature and learning theories. Then at the bottom of the slide, I sometimes wonder whether we might be on the same wavelength in terms of encouraging or critical feedback. I think sometimes there's a stage in your journey when you just want to be told, well done, you finished, good effort. And there are other times in your journey when you want a bit more insight. So I wonder whether there could also be an opportunity for students to state a preference. Not sure about that, but it was just a thought that came through to me in terms of the emotional side of feedback. In the last question during the mid-talk question time, we started to think about the implementation of peer feedback. And on this slide, I've tried to summarize some of what I see as the key issues in implementing peer feedback well. And I should say, I think it's a very complicated thing. And the more I read and the more I hear about peer feedback, I think the more aware of the complexities of it and more aware that some of my attempts at carrying out peer feedback haven't been very sophisticated. And I've tried to divide this sort of guideline or advice slide into two halves. And I think the top half is more what we need to do before the students carry out peer feedback. So it's kind of the preparatory stage. I think we need to teach them how to do peer feedback a bit more, the kind of scaffolding and coaching function. I think we need to do a better job of explaining to them what's in it for them, what are they going to gain from peer feedback. And I think we need to model more our own experiences of peer feedback. If we can give some examples of when peer feedback was useful for us, either composing peer feedback or receiving peer feedback, I think it sounds more convincing to them. Some of us sometimes wonder why scholars are always so willing to do unpaid extra work for journals when they peer review for them. And presumably one of the reasons is we see a lot of benefits of doing peer review for ourselves, keeping in touch with the field, comparing our own work with that of others, composing and thinking about other people's work. So I think we can do more in the modeling of peer feedback and modeling of our own experiences of feedback. And then at the bottom half of this slide, the kind of implementation aspects. I know I've made the mistake of sometimes putting students into pairs. If they're in a pair, it's a bit limited because you're only seeing one other sample and you're only getting one comment. So trios or quartets, the literature indicates, are much more favorable because you're exposed to more different samples of student work and you're receiving more comments in an analogous way to peer review in academia when we usually get 2 or 3 peer reviews. As I said in relation to Nichols' work, I think we need to leverage the comparisons between our own work and that of others. And then ideally feedback should always be interactive and some dialogue so that we can negotiate meaning. And then there should be some kind of revision opportunity so that the students can make use of the peer feedback in order to enhance their work in progress. So it seems to me there's a lot to consider in terms of feedback literacy capacities, both for teachers and students in relation to peer feedback. But if you've ever tried it out before and it's gone wrong, which is not uncommon, I would encourage you to persevere. Try some of your small teaching strategies. Try and change one or two of the key dimensions and see if it can work even better, because I think peer feedback is critical for mass higher education, critical for feedback literacy, and critical for lifelong learning. So I think making it even better is key. Martin pointed out to me a week or so ago that programmatic assessment is quite a big thing in the Netherlands, quite a big thing in medical education and in competency-based education. So as a kind of aspiration, I'm wondering if we can move from programmatic assessment to program-wide feedback approaches. But I should acknowledge that program-wide or program-based feedback strategies are still in their infancy. Very little literature out there yet, but maybe through coaching and relationships and longitudinal development, there may be some prospects for the integration of assessment and feedback at the program level. There may also be some prospects in helping students to understand criteria. You know, we usually have our rubrics, our criteria, but they're usually not transparent to students. They need a bit of unpacking. They probably need some samples. And I think variety versus continuity of assessment tasks is a particularly difficult challenge. In the past, I often thought that a variety of assessment tasks is good because it enables students to showcase different talents, written talents, oral talents, interactive talents, designing posters, doing e-portfolios. But if there are many different tasks in a course, or too many different tasks, does this make it very difficult for students to understand the requirements, what is needed? Does it also make it very difficult to apply latent feedback from one task to another? If you think how challenging academic writing is, or writing a good academic essay, it takes us decades and thousands of hours to be really good at writing an extended piece of academic prose. So I have an open mind, and I'm interested in what you guys think, whether variety or a bit more continuity of a certain number of assessment tasks is a challenge or an issue for program-based assessment and program-based feedback. You know, we have oral presentations, we have essays, we have group projects. We've got a lot of things, and maybe getting them right takes more time than is devoted to them. Just to round up, in terms of further developments, I know in Europe you often like questionnaires and these kind of scales. There is one under development, and it's mainly led by the world leaders in assessment and feedback research in Cradle in Deakin University. And it's also in collaboration with Yangtze in Education University of Hong Kong and Lipnovich in New York. My very final slide is to come back to this idea of shared responsibilities and interplay between teacher and student feedback literacy, and just pose a final question for us in terms of what kind of learning designs or program designs might enable students and teachers, or teachers and students, to partner together in developing feedback literacy. Because I think that in a good setting, or in an appropriate setting, there can be a mutual interplay between the teacher contribution and the student contribution. And I think the more we talk to our students about feedback, and the more our students tell me what are their concerns, what kind of feedback helps them, what they feel about the timing, how it can affect them in the emotions. I think the more exchanges we have around feedback, the better prospects we have for moving forward. The slides are there. I've sent the organizers the slides, and I very much welcome any questions now. And thanks very much for listening to me today.
Thank you, David. In the chat, people are already putting up a network on feedback literacy, so your work here is done.
Good.
I have some questions still from the chat. There's someone who asked, what do you think should be the first thing that we train students in with regard to feedback literacy when they enter the program?
Good question. I think I would probably start with the making judgments box, because I think that feeds in very well to peer feedback. I think in most school systems around the world, the students will have done some peer feedback in schools, but it may not have been that positively received, or it may not have been that sophisticated. So I think if we could share with them the rationale for peer feedback, give them some practice in a supportive atmosphere of comparing and contrasting some work in progress. I think seeing other people's work is incredibly beneficial. And imagine you're a student who is not necessarily the most talented one in the class. If you're only ever seeing your own work, you'll never actually see what is really, really good work. So I think I would start with a bit of training in peer feedback, being very aware that for peer feedback to work, it needs to be sustained and cumulative and potentially across a whole program. And I think that would be a good way to start.
All right, and in that light, Martin asked, "What do you think students need a certain level of feedback literacy in order to participate effectively in peer feedback assignments?"
Yes, I think they do, but I think it's also very crucially an attitude. If for some reason in school you had a very bad experience with peer feedback and you just think it's something very terrible, or if you don't really understand why you're doing it, I think with all teaching strategies, whatever the teacher is doing, if the students don't understand the rationale or appreciate the rationale or see how they can benefit from it, then I think it's very difficult. So I think firstly, they've got to see there is potentially some value in it. And that's why I think the modeling that we can do, I think maybe we could start by sharing some of our experiences of when peer review in academia was useful. But I think you're also welcome to share some painful experiences or unfair experiences, because this is the nature of peer review, that it's not a panacea, it's not perfect, it sometimes goes wrong. But it's a bit like democracy. It's what did Churchill say? Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I think peer review in academia is not at all perfect, but we don't have any other better system. So I think by starting with peer feedback, peer review, we're kind of beginning to induct the students into academic ways of working, which I think we should be doing in the university system. I think we should be trying to help them learn the differences between what it is in school and what it is in university, and preparing them for the more autonomous and independent and self-regulating role that we see as feedback literacy and related theories such as self-regulated learning and evaluative judgment. I think we're trying to prepare them in the first year of university for this jump from a mainly teacher-directed process, perhaps in some school systems, to a more independent, autonomous system. I think that would be roughly my answer.
Mm-hmm. And for teachers to support students in the development of their feedback literacy, do they need their own like what would the teachers need to have in terms of feedback literacy in order to do that? Like,
yeah, and this is one of the things I worry about, that we have so many things on our plate and there are so many capacities that we need, and we need to be very good at our online learning, our digital pedagogy, our post-pandemic pedagogy. We've got to do our research, we've got to do our administration, we may be homeschooling our kids. It does worry me that academics have so much on their plates, which is why I like this idea of small teaching of Jim Lang. But I suppose the key theme in terms of the teacher today is design. So I think we need to design our feedback processes effectively with something like the task 1, task 2, task 3 sequence. We need to design the peer feedback in a way congruent with that six-point slide I just showed. And I suppose we need to build on our experience. I think we've all had occasions where peer feedback didn't work very well. And I think we need to reflect and discuss with our colleagues, discuss in teams. I mean, with peer feedback, it doesn't always work. There can be atmosphere or student-related factors. But I think keep experimenting, exploring, trying to make it better with small adjustments. So I think open-mindedness, willingness to try again, willingness to build on experience, share experience with colleagues. I think these would be some of the capacities that teachers would need for implementing peer feedback successfully.
all right, thank you. I don't think I have any more questions from our audience, but I have one question. I remember at the Congress last week, you asked the Deacon, the Cradle team, to maybe if they wanted to develop a one-page instruction for teachers to on how to effectively implement peer feedback. Now you said you were hoping that they would start that page, but I was wondering if you have any ideas of your own that should be on that one page of instruction and tips for teachers.
Yeah, I think my initial ideas are basically on this slide. One of my rationales was we've been talking about the issue of teacher change in terms of feedback, that there's lots of good ideas out there, but maybe for busy teachers, it's not so digestible, it's not so practical. We all know it's easy to listen to a talk such as this one, but it's much harder to then go back into your context and your teaching situation and actually implement some ideas. So I was thinking if we could co-develop a like one-page tips and guidelines, and then 5 to 10 of us were actually promoting this in all the different talks we're doing, that this might be a way of bringing consistency into the messages. But the problem, telling or suggesting, is quite limited. So I can throw out an idea, but some people said, well, it's a nice idea, but I have a feeling that probably nothing will happen. And this is one of the problems with feedback, that there's lots of good ideas, but it requires a lot of willpower and time and resources and commitment for teams to actually come together and want to do something. And we all have our different ideas, so it maybe other people think there is something else that is even more important. So yeah, this is what I think is some of the critical issues, but I don't know if anybody sees additional elements or issues in peer feedback. I suppose the composing element, I think, is an important one. Selling that there are benefits of composing probably even more than receiving, because I think students' main complaint is I didn't get any good feedback from my peer, or I prefer teacher feedback to peer feedback. So I think it's building in the comparisons, the learning from examining other people's work. I think that's what I see as the key, and I think that's what Nicol is arguing.
And what would you say is the, with concern to the managing of the effects of students when they receive feedback? What would you say is where would you start as a teacher to support the development of that?
I think it's what Rola Rajawi and her colleagues call an educational alliance. Educational alliance is when teachers and students have the relationships for feedback to flourish. You know, feedback is a very relational and emotional kind of process often. But of course, relationships can be very difficult to develop in massive higher education with large classes, etc. So if we can, whatever the class size, try to create an atmosphere that makes the student think that the teacher has their best interest at heart and that the teacher just wants to help them to grow. We don't want the receiver of feedback to think we are just criticizing or being harsh. We want to feel that there is some kind of shared relationship of improvement. And if through enthusiasm or kindness or trust or care or respect, all these relational pedagogy elements, if we can try to create this kind of atmosphere, then we can have an atmosphere where critical feedback can be shared, but accepted in a positive mindset. So I think it's the relational side of things that is difficult but important. And even in a large class size, I hope we can demonstrate the relationships through enthusiasm, through listening to students, through the way we design our classes, even trying to learn the names, trying to think from their perspective. So difficult, but I think emphasizing the relational can be one way of maybe managing the social affective dimension of feedback.
All right, thank you. I think that's it for the questions.
I think there's one interesting question still in the chat about the difference or the function of grading and how it impacts feedback. It's a question from Jeroen that you mentioned that feedback after the grade is not perceived as functional by students. What, in your opinion, is the influence of the imposed assessment system giving grades, in most cases, on students' perceptions of the feedback function?
Yes, that's a good point. I think one of the dissatisfactions from the students is this conflating of the grade and the comment. Because as I mentioned at the beginning in my first research, the students were very clear that once the final grade had been awarded, comments were A, of little use to them, and even worse, potentially annoying. You know, now you tell me what I should have done. Why didn't you tell me that beforehand? So I think we should try, if we can, and it's difficult, but if we can disentangle the grading function that we do at the end for accountability and because assessment generally needs a grade to go with it. So that's one task, the grading at the end. But another element is the feedback process is during the course. So I think if there's one thing we could do is give less commentary at the end and more support, scaffolding, design during the process. And when I pitched this to students, they said to me they would be fine for less comment at the end. Now, some people say, well, there's also a quality assurance function, and Big Brother may be looking over their shoulder, or external examiners may be saying, well, have you given a lot of comment on the final task? And to me, that's a difficult one. But I think if we're trying to produce good feedback processes, we need to change the sequence more so that there is a bit more interaction and dialogue of different forms during the course. And it could be on the virtual learning environment, it can be peer feedback, whatever it is, it's more during. And then at the end, I think it's basically the grading role, and you might like to highlight one or two key areas. But I think if teachers are giving a lot of commentary at the end, it's something of a wasted effort that might be redeployed to other aspects of design or sequencing. Does that make sense, Martin, do you think?
It does. Okay, thank you very much. I think you gave us a lot of inspiration with this talk. There's a lively chat with a lot of questions, and a lot of people want to share more about feedback literacy and how to promote feedback literacy in students. So as Anne also pointed out, we will bring all this inspiration together, and we will start a new learning network on feedback literacy here in the Netherlands to collaborate with each other and to find out how we can promote feedback literacy in students and teachers. I think there's a lot of work to do, and can be very good to share our thoughts on that. So this was a very good start for this new collaboration in the Netherlands. So thank you very much, David, Carless, for your talk today and for your time. And we hope that we can ask you more in the near future on this, because our discussion is just only started today. So thank you very much, and thank you all the participants today. As I said, we will share the recordings of today, the slides, and also we will make a report of this meeting, and we will start a new network, and we will share all the information about the new network to you all. A lot of chats. So let's be this the beginning of a new discussion about feedback literacy. Thank you all for joining us today, and David, Carless, thank you for your inspirational talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Tim. Bye.